This evening is the second part of my two-part series on grief and sleep. And while in part one, we took a look at the physical and emotional impact of grief on health, and in particular sleep. This time, we'll be looking at the different um, types of bereavement that can occur, and how what the manner of death and the relationship of the person who's grieving to the person who died can also have an impact. And we'll also look at some tips and tools that may be able to help people to better cope with grief. But the first thing we have to remember that not all grief is created equal. There are many ways to grieve and to feel grief and express grief as there are people. Everyone is different, and so how they respond and react to grief will also be different. And there's no right or wrong way to grieve, but taking the time to understand you how the death occurred, and to your reaction to that can help you perhaps find some ways to mourn in a sense, if that makes sense to you. So um, there's there may be prescribed religious rituals and things, but when all the rituals are done and everyone goes home and you're on your own, you need to be able to have some kind of resource to be able to get you through those times. It also has to be remembered that not only who has died, but the manner in which they died can also have a very different impacts on the people who were left behind. And we'll look at some of those losses, and these are losses related to a personal relationship. But it could equally be true for loss of a job, loss of a home, um, so their loss is loss is loss. If we're feeling it, it's a loss. But the first type of bereavement we're looking at is the loss of a spouse. And when losing a spouse is often a very big factor in experiencing sleep disturbances, and this form of grief is the most likely to cause insomnia and sleep loss. There's theories around to suggest um, that it may be adjusting to a new sleeping arrangement, i.e., no longer having someone next to you sharing a bed. Um, may be one of the top reasons for this loss of sleep after bereavement of a spouse. Some studies that have been done shown that some 28% of those grieving the loss of a spouse may experience an enhanced risk of depression within the first 2 years of recovering from the bereavement. So that major depression will also impact sleep. So that there's a kind of cycle that gets set up. You feel grief, you don't sleep. You don't sleep, that can cascade into a series of problems that can become insomnia and other sleep issues. There were some studies conducted by Rice University, Northwestern University in the U.S., which found that the people who had recently been widowed were 2 to 3 times more likely to experience some kind of inflammation due to sleep disturbances. Because remember, the body at night, while we're asleep, is healing and repairing itself. But if a person is in grief, their immune system is already at a low level because of the stress. So it makes their immune system even less able to fight off infections, to fight off overuse of, well, if you're overusing muscles and joints, that can cause inflammation, and the stress will only enhance that. And I have to hold up my hand to that one because I experienced this myself during my own husband's terminal illness, that I developed joint pain, some of it which was as a result of an old injury being aggravated, but this was also new pains, and but I didn't have the time or even the energy to be able to get to a doctor to attend to it until, unfortunately, after my spouse had passed. So, elevated inflammation like this in the muscle sheaths or in the joints can lead to an increased risk of cardiovascular problems or even death in extreme cases. So, the loss of a spouse is highly stressful. I mean, out of all deaths are stressful, but the death of a spouse can be particularly difficult, especially if there had been some other issues involved. Perhaps they had died of cancer or some long term illness that has really taken it out of the person who was involved with them or involved with their care. Another special case, a very special case, is the grieving that comes following a suicide. And some experts believe that the grief felt by those who are dealing with the loss of someone through suicide is often more severe than other forms of grief. And they say in some ways, grief after suicide can be compared to the symptoms and effects of post traumatic stress disorder. So the people who are left behind following the death of someone by suicide, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of questions that there will never be definitive answers to because the person involved is no longer there. There also may be specific setbacks that people who are recovering from this form of grief as well. One of the big issues is just the stigma of suicide, which makes it more difficult to not only to process, but be able to reach out and seek help for it, to be able to get through it. And on top of that, you may have, excuse me, you may have local or cultural or religious beliefs around suicide that can make it even more difficult because it's just a taboo subject and we just don't go there. But there are support groups, especially now, that are specifically designed to help people get through the trauma of the death of a loved one by suicide. So because of the guilt and shame, confusion, and anger as well around the death. And that's not to say that other forms of grief don't experience those as well. Those are all various stages of grief. So but this is a particularly peculiar case because you'll never have an answer. You'll never really, really, and truly know why. And that just haunts people. The Another special case is that losing your parents. And I've always said to clients, I said, when you finally have lost both your parents, you really have to grow up at that point, and parent yourself because they're no longer there, at least not physically. So, losing a parent at any age is difficult, whether you're a young child or an adult. But what the research has found is that younger children are more at risk for depression and other side effects from grief after one of their parents has actually passed away. And some 1 in 20 children under the age of 15 are likely to experience mental health issues after losing a parent. And while the loss of a parent is going to be devastating to anyone at any age, There are some experts that actually believe that gender can also play a role in how well children are able to cope. Well, some believe that women may feel more grief around the death of their mothers, while men have a harder time adjusting to the loss of their fathers. My personal experience is that whoever is the child has developed the strongest attachment to, that is where the grief will be the strongest, whether it be the mother or the father, either sex of, of the child in question. Grief is grief, and sometimes there may be, may feel it more with one parent than the other. Depends again on the relationship that they had with one another. Children are a particular case. Children will frequently experience grief much more severely than adults will. First of all, because they don't really understand. And one study actually noted that bereaved children showed a lack of interest in the things that they would commonly do, and generally expressed less positive emotion than other children. But it was also noted that children with major depressive symptoms showed some signs that bereaved children did not, which were feelings of worthlessness and guilt. But the most disturbing thing about this particular study is that it found that some 37% of bereaved children would show suicidal tendencies. So they don't have the emotions, if there's particularly young children, they don't have the emotional language to be able to express what they feel. And if there is a child that is grieving, it's best to get professional assistance with that. People who deal specifically with counseling children to be able to help them to cope, because again, they don't have the language to express their feelings, and it can just knock them to sideways and affect them for the rest of their life. And again, increase even the likelihood of suicide. I'm going to shift gears here for a minute and look at how coping with grief actually alters the brain. So, a bit of neuroscience here. Now, you may have heard of the term baby brain to describe the the effect that a new baby in the home can have on the parents, particularly the mother if she's breastfeeding, because you're overwhelmed and you're you're not getting enough sleep. You may have even heard of the term chemo brain, where people are going through cancer treatment and have trouble concentrating, and as a reaction to all of the medication that they're taking. Now, there's also a new concept that's come along, and that's grief brain. It's not discussed as often because people do not talk about death very often unless they have to, but it's just as real. Now, um, grief brain again, and I have to agree with this. Your brain, you're trying to process a lot of things all at the same time. For example, funeral arrangements, making phone calls to friends and family, thinking about all kinds of things, little things, small things. Do I feel like eating? What to eat? I mean, your brain takes seems to take a holiday, and it's really quite hard to process things, or you get bogged down in the minutiae of things because it's easier to focus on one little thing than to have to kind of look around and see how your life has changed as a result of this bereavement. But there are some things you could do that can help with things with the grief brain. One of them that's very important is self-care. Take the time to take care of yourself, because if you don't, who's going to, quite frankly? You need to make sure that you're getting what you need to be as relax this, you can be under the circumstances so that you can cope better, to make sure that you get sufficient sleep, however you need to be able to get that to happen. I mean, and there's lots of ways you can do that, from the natural to the prescription. But there are things that you can do to help yourself, to to take care of yourself, to be good to yourself, to be gentle with yourself, taking time out, and just, whether it be stepping back from work for a time, taking some leave if you can, if it's possible, or changing your schedule around to give you the time and space that you need to be able to heal. But it takes the time to grieve, is the time it takes to grieve, and everybody's timetable is different, just like the way everybody experiences grief is different. But allow yourself the time and space to be able to grieve. Don't keep filling yourself up with things to do. That's just avoidance. That's what a psychotherapist like me would call it, avoidance. You don't want to deal with it. So you fill your time up with flipping through your phone and calling everybody you know and going out every night so you don't have to feel. But the feelings don't go away. They just, if you just press them, like just stuffing clothes into a closet, eventually the closet explodes. It's not going to stay there. That energy has to be dissipated in some way. Mental malware, that's another thing about having too much time in your hands. You know that expression, idle hands or the devil's workshop. An idle mind, is particularly when you're grieving, it can be literally deadly, because it's so easy to spiral down into that negative self-talk, and going through the what if I could have, what if I should have done this, if I could have, would have, should have. Stop shooting yourself. It doesn't help, and it only can make you spiral into a place where you really do not wish to be, and maybe hard to get out of again. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Yes, the health systems are really overstretched and overburdened. And COVID seems to be the excuse for everything when things can't get done these days. But get support. There are services, paid and free, that can offer support. And the friends and family are wonderful, and they are a form of support. But when they go back to their lives and you're left with all these feelings, you need you can't just sit on them or try to ignore them, because that cascades again into a negative spiral. An objective listening ear is a wonderful thing. And having been a bereavement counselor myself for several years, I know how much and how powerful that can be, to have someone who will just listen and doesn't have opinions about it and isn't making judgments about it, but just letting the person express their grief and be sit with it, and work through it, find ways to work through it. There's no timetable for the grieving process, as I said before. And most people, after several weeks, will start to take up their lives again and start to come out on the other side. But how sometimes, the reactions that we have to grief are very explosive, and extreme. And if you're having thoughts about suicide, about ending it all, you can't cope anymore, please, please call someone. I mean, it could be, one of the helplines like the Samaritans. I mean, whoever, it could be your doctor, it could be, even if you have to go to your local pharmacist and say, I need some help. Get help immediately, because again, the longer you leave it, the worse it will. It, it, it can be very devastating, not only for you, but for the ones who love you. Now, all of these things can, again, all of these different types of griefs, and there's different types of things with people coming back from war, There's a grief there. There's all kinds of losses. Again, like I said, it could be losses in job, a home, a pet. So loss is loss, and how you experience it is going to be different. But there are some things that you can do to at least help you to sleep in these such difficult circumstances. And the first thing, strangely enough, if you're having poor sleep, uh, one of the things you should look at is to reduce the number of naps you take. Because if you're catnapping constantly during the day, you're not going to be able to sleep at night. And sleeping at night is our natural diurnal rhythm, day night rhythm. And that's when our bodies carry out its essential repair work. And if it doesn't get that deeper those into those deeper levels of sleep, those repair um, the activities will not take place, and that can lead to things like obesity, diabetes, heart trouble. So it's really essential that you look at your sleep patterns and try to find ways to improve it without alcohol or medication like sleep aids, because those are not they don't allow you to attain the normal stages of sleep, which are of some 5 stages. You go straight to the bottom and you stay there. You basically are unconscious until the medication starts to wear off and you start to wake up, and then you don't feel rested because you didn't go through those normal sleep stages. Movement. I always tell my clients, move it or lose it. And that means they mean, not just physical movement, but mental movement. Exercising is a wonderful way to get us moving, to enhance the relaxation response of the body, and naturally wear it so that you will sleep. Starting things like starting a journal, journaling can be a good way to be able to get out those feelings, and be able to work through them, because you can't work with what you don't know, what you don't recognize and acknowledge as being an issue. And an extreme that is that, for example, a person who is addicted to alcohol or drugs, you can take them to rehab 50 billion times and it's not going to work because they're not engaged with the process. They need to want to change, because it's not going to happen otherwise. They need to make that decision. No one can make it for them. So always check, be aware of yourself, get moving. They say that a healthy body and a healthy mind, and that's very true. There's a bilateral relationship between the mind and the body, which makes sense since they're all connected. And even if we sometimes act like headless horsemen, if your body is tired, you will sleep. If you are carrying out some kind of activity that engages body and mind, the likelihood of you being able to fall asleep and stay asleep, more importantly, and go through those sleep stages is enhanced. You can do other little things that, like reorganize your bedroom. I mean, if the loss of having a body next to you is causing you discomfort and grief, then either moving the position of the bed, changing the bed completely, and with new bedding, maybe can alleviate some of those symptoms. One simple trick that can work, and is something that I've tried myself, is taking one of those long body pillows, and propping it up next to me, so the feeling of the pillow against me would sort of be um, uh, like a security blanket, if you will, but it felt like there was somebody laying next to me, so that it didn't feel quite so lonely. It reminds me of a song by, I think, by Sting. It's like the bed's too big without you. And that is a real thing. If you reach over and that person's no longer there, it's going to cause a disturbance. So that's a sort of change the bed, or get a pillow that can prop against you to give you that sensation of someone being there. I mean, it's a temporary fix, but it can be helpful. Seeking professional help of always is, particularly if you're having suicidal thoughts, is important. And they can have suggestions for long-term sleep disruption. And there are things that therapeutic counseling and psychotherapy can also be helpful. So, but horses for courses. You have to discuss with someone, a professional, health professional, what might be the best option for you. There's now this is something unusual that people may not be aware of, and it's called mitori in Japan, but here in the West they've become known as death cafes. Um, this was an idea where people can come together to talk openly, honestly, and without judgment about death and dying. Now, you think this would be a really gloomy and horrible thing, but actually, no. I attended one years ago with a Japanese friend here in London, and it was beautiful little cakes. There was this nice music. There was nice tea to go with these beautiful little cakes. And all kinds of aspects around death and dying were talked about. There may have been people who were suffering bereavement. There were people who were dying and knew they were dying that were in the group. But we all had our different views and different experiences, and we shared them over tea and cakes. And you came out of there actually feeling better about death than you had when you walked in, or maybe having a different perspective than you had when you first walked in the door. And I would suggest, if you can find, there's death cafes around the world now. If you can find one in your local community, wherever it is, I know there's at least one in London, and there's others springing up all over the place. Attend one, because it's a really eye-opening experience. But in the end, it's just important to remember a few things. First of all, managing grief is an individual thing. You have to manage it on your own terms and in your own way, in your own time. A support system is vital. I can't stress this enough. Going through grief and without a support mechanism is very, very hard to get through, if at all. It's that difficult, because so many buttons are being pushed, so many things that have to be looked at and taken care of and sorted out, that grief is going to be jumping out of the closet at different times in different ways for you. And having people around you to give you support, not just friends, but professional support as well, if necessary, is a really good thing to have happen. And remember to be gentle with yourself. Healing takes time. You get a deep cut or you break your arm, it doesn't heal in 24 hours. It takes time. And it's normal to make a bit of progress and then find you slip back again. Or it's part of the process. As we hit certain sore spots, we may regress a little bit, but it's part of the process and quite normal. And there can be things that trigger setbacks, like anniversary, whether they be anniversary of the death of the person, anniversary, wedding anniversaries, or other things. And that anniversary effect is real. People will have accidents on those days. All kinds of things can happen because, not even consciously, they're um, enacting in some way the trauma that they experience when this particular event occurred. And it may be having to take a break from those traditions or habits in order to break those that cycle of triggers creating havoc in your life. So there you have it. Grief is as individual as the people experiencing it, and the manner and relationship of the death, and the relationship rather of the person who died with the person who is also will impact how the grief expresses itself and suggest ways that may be best to cope with it. If you're having a problem with grief or handling grief, or don't know where to go to get help, please do make a book absolutely free consultation to get some tips and advice about how you can get help and from whom. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Have a great evening and start to the week, and I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye bye.